But I'm Dr. Charlene Brown, the founder of CNA Simulations, and we are here to talk about documentation today. I'm pleased that we also have Danielle Young, and our other speaker, Jennifer DeRose Barjar, has been called away in a family emergency. So Danielle's going to cover Jennifer's part of the presentation. So let's review our agenda. Now let's get this Zoom bar out of the way. So I'm welcoming you right now. It's happening. We are going to go through a little bit of Simulation 101. We're going to talk about preparing students and challenges with teaching. And then we're going to review simulating documentation in different settings, starting with our virtual clinical simulation, as well as things that you do in the lab and in clinical rotations. And then we'll review lessons learned, have a discussion, and share some announcements. So let's jump in. That's me. That's Jennifer in the middle, and that's Danielle, who you'll be seeing in just a moment. Simulation, this is a quote that I see all over the place, used to really just explain what simulation is. It's a technique, not necessarily a technology. And we're using these techniques to replace or amplify real experiences with guided experiences that replicate that experience of being in the real world in an interactive way. The International Nursing Association for Simulation and Clinical Learning, which is kind of the go-to association for nursing simulations, they released a set of standards defining like how to design simulations. I'm going to highlight 3 of those standards. The first is pre-briefing. So before conducting or engaging students in simulation, one needs to create a pre-briefing plan that includes the materials and orienting to the student to what's happening. I'm pretty sure most of you do that naturally. Then there's the scenario or case or activity, which is the simulation itself. And then there's debriefing, creating a way for the students to reflect on the care they've delivered or the skill that they exercise during the simulation. The research shows that debriefing is one of the most important parts of simulation and that a lot of learning gets cemented during that debriefing period. There are many types of simulation, and I'm sure if I actually polled everyone in this group about all of the creative ways you were simulating during the pandemic, we could probably create like 25 slides of types of simulation. But let's go ahead and start talking about preparing students for documentation. So Danielle, take it away.
All right. Hello. Nice to meet everyone. I didn't put in the chat, but I'm from Kansas. And so welcome, everyone. All right. If you want to go to the next slide, Charlene. All right. So preparing students, really before students, start the simulations or in the simulations or any kind of simulation that you create, reviewing basically the basics first with them is pretty key. And, just some things that I'm sure you guys already know and that you're already doing, just reviewing the fact that when we document, it becomes a permanent legal record. So you can't change it. We go over with students, how do you correct something if you do make a mistake, if there's an error, if you need to do a late entry, that type of thing, really going over with the students, not charting for anyone else. And because this also serves, and this is something I was going through with my students today, documentation really serves as a proof of care for billing, for evidence, all sorts of things. And then also just going through the fact with students that we want to chart as soon as we're done, and if you don't document it, it's not done. And paying attention to that spelling, grammar, and those approved abbreviations, which, can vary from facility and from state to state. Go ahead, Charlene. All right. And then these are the things that I know that we're all teaching, basically that subjective versus objective data that needs to be documented. And there's a wide variety of things that you can set up simulations for, or basically be able to help students prepare for when it comes to documentation. And we'll go through a couple of these a little bit later today, like how to help students learn to document and take an output and such. All right, so what are some of the challenges that we face with teaching documentation? Well, myself as a CNA instructor, and we're going to hear from you guys here before long, but I find a lot of challenges with teaching documentation. We don't have the ability to access simulation technology sometimes. It's either one, not available. There's those financial limitations. There's those administrators who just don't understand why we need the support that we need. And students don't have access to electronic medical records or electronic health records. We don't have access as instructors in the classroom setting, in the skills setting, to those electronic health records, those electronic medical records. So it makes it very, very hard to be able to show students what documentation looks like in the real world. Okay, Charlene. All right. Another challenge that we face is definitely that time to teach documentation skills. Sometimes it seems like we're really just going through things as quickly as possible, especially with everything that we have faced the last couple of years. Just having that time to be able to teach the skills that students need to know how to properly document. And then to research and create tools. I know for myself personally as an instructor, just finding the time to research and come up with creative ways and to create those tools to help simulate and allow students to have the opportunity to document can be pretty tough. Other things that we face, definitely staff and faculty shortages. One of the things that I hear quite a bit is larger classroom sizes. And then of course, you've got different learning styles for different students. Some things work for some students better than others. And we all know that, some of our students are very hands-on, some are very visual, some are auditory. And then one of the things that we have been seeing quite a bit of, I personally in the classroom, because I teach both at the high school level and then I teach it at the college level, CNA classes. And there's a diverse age group right now. I see a lot of older adults leaving jobs that they've had for years, careers that they've had, and they're getting into healthcare. They're wanting to become CNAs and possibly go on to nursing school. And so they're kind of making this midlife change. And one of the struggles I have noticed is different levels of tech savvy. So that can create some difficulties when teaching documentation also.
So what can we do? I'm going to take you through a little bit of CNA Simulations and show you how we document and some of the lessons we've learned so far. So this is our documentation module, but I'm actually going to switch over and show you a little bit of the simulation and how we document.
Yes, I'm more short of breath. It's been worse though.
So this is Darna. She has CHF and COPD, and she is recovering at the nursing home after being hospitalized with pneumonia. Teresa, the CNA student in blue, has just assisted Darna onto the bedpan, and Darna is feeling more short of breath. So we asked the students to actually measure Darna's respiratory rate, right? And once they actually measure it, they answer right here, what was her respiratory rate? Well, when it comes time to actually document, the majority of this simulation is focused on assisting with the bedpan, measuring urine output, and other things related to the genitourinary tract, not vital signs. So when our students actually go to document, we find that they are not documenting the respiratory rate. So they go over here, they don't go over here to scroll down to find respiratory rate. And the interesting, at least for us, the interesting thing about that is we believe that students are struggling to translate the documentation requirements out of context, right? So if you have vital signs day, or if you have urine output day in skills lab, students know, okay, here's my paper, I'm going to write the urine output. They have a context and they know what's happening. But even though the student is performing the skills in simulation, and if you ask them separately, name all the vital signs that you need to document, they would list respiratory rate. There's some challenge where they aren't connecting the dots in simulation. And we think it's because they haven't really had to make these decisions on their own in the context of patient care without the kind of guidance that you get when you're on rotations or when you're in the skills lab. And this is actually what they need to learn how to do. So let's move on to another example. In this case, Teresa is discovering that Miss Sophie has a reddish discoloration at the base of her big toe. It's there. And so, of course, she calls the nurse. She assists the nurse as the nurse puts a bandage on. And the nurse leaves and she continues with care. In this simulation, Teresa has assisted Miss Sophie with ambulation. She's assisted Sophie with foot care, and she's going to assist Miss Sophie with side positioning, all the while having conversations with Miss Sophie about her family and all kinds of other topics. So again, when students go to document, they document the ambulation. They might document the side positioning, but they completely blank on the fact that they need to document what they saw, the fact that they called the nurse, and what happened. And again, I think it's because it's out of context. It's an unexpected thing. So we throw these unexpected challenges into the simulation, and the students are struggling to kind of integrate their knowledge of documentation in that context and recognize that the discovery and report to the nurse is something to document in the care notes. Here's another example. So we have Teresa is removing the bedpan. She spills a little bit of urine on the chunks. They have a whole conversation about it, but when it comes time to document, students aren't recognizing that that counts as a not measurable part of documenting urine output. So these are the lessons that we're learning, and I actually find it really interesting. And we're designing to address these challenges and to help bring in some of the some documentation teaching, but I'll talk more about that afterwards. The other thing students struggle with is levels of dependence. So we have this cheat sheet. There's another page to it that we include in the simulation so that students can reference it to try to figure out where the resident they've just taken care of fits into this level of dependence. But I actually want to turn it over to Danielle because she experienced exactly what we're hoping teachers will experience in terms of pre-briefing and training her students as they do the simulation and as they document. So Danielle, why don't you tell the group what you were telling me earlier?
So basically, my students have been working through some different simulations in the simulation with another scenario, another resident, basically. And basically what I noticed today is we were going over the documentation before they started doing the documentation section of the simulation. And it dawned on me, there are a couple of things that I've been missing as an instructor. And a big one for me is just the levels of dependence. You know, we talk about the fact that, you know, it only took one person to assist, or they only need supervision, or they only, they may need two people to assist. But it never really made the connection with students that not only do we know those things, do we do those things, but we have to document those things. Those level of dependence really affect a lot of different areas. And so it really hadn't dawned on me until, like I said today, that, yeah, I need to really help students make that connection that once you do this, you know, we also have to document it. And there's all these areas of documentation that need to be done. And I think that's why a lot of my students in the past too hadn't done so well with some of the documentation, is because I was leaving out just some of those key pieces I really hadn't thought about helping them make that bridge.
Okay, thanks, Danielle. So now we're going to transition to reflecting on some of the ways that you already document or simulate documentation in the lab and during clinicals. And then we'll be transitioning to a discussion shortly thereafter.
All right. So yeah. So some simulating documentation in the skills lab. We're already doing a lot of this in the skills lab, and we just don't even realize that a lot of what we're doing is simulation. And really just thinking about making those connections for students And as you're doing things in the skills labs, just even saying things like, okay, it took one person or two people, if you were to document that, how would you document that? So just helping make those connections. But, some of the examples that I use is I do an intake and output skills lab, and I have a whole worksheet that goes with it, and I have them estimate how much was taken in, how much was taken out, and I set up different stations with different types of urine, and that kind of allows for them to kind of look to do some observing, be able to document on the worksheet. And I always ask on that worksheet too, what kind of interventions could we put into place for this resident, and how could we document this? How would you document this if you needed to document it? And so just really trying to make those connections. Some other things that we do is, Jen, our other instructor, had this great idea of, she takes paper plates, they draw the food on the paper plate, and then they look at percentage of food consumption. And if you were going to document how much food that resident consumed, using that as a way to help that connection with that documentation. Using urine output flow sheets, skin integrity, that's a big simulation that I set up for my students in the skills lab, is looking at the mannequin's skin or printing off pictures of, irritation or skin ulcers, and basically giving them those tools to be able to perform like a skin assessment and make that documentation. And, a lot of times I just pull different types of forms that you can easily find for free on the web. Also using incident forms, students learning how to document properly on an incident form, or even a vital signs flow sheet, why it's important, that we say that it was the right arm that we took the blood pressure in, or the left arm, or that when we took their O2 sat, are they on room air? Do we need to document? Yeah, they're on O2, so that way when that's put into the computer or that's handed to the nurse, all of the information is there. So really just working on designing those simulation tools for documentation. So this goes into a little bit more of my skills lab that I do with intake and output. And like I said, I have created a worksheet. It's a simulation tool. I never really looked at it as one. I always, when I think simulation, I think you have to be doing something virtual, or you have to be doing something on a simulation mannequin, that gives you signals back. But really, this is, even though it is a worksheet, I am simulating what to look for when you look for somebody's intake and output. And not only when you look at somebody's output as far as urine, but looking at all those things that are really important with the urine: the color, the clarity, the odor, what interventions can be done. And so I like to use things like food coloring and flour and maybe a little bit of vinegar to change the different types of urine I make. And I usually use like a urinal, a hat, a graduated cylinder. And I talk about why it's important also to know your different containers, and to be able to read from those different containers and read those milliliters. And then I let students go around to those different stations and be able to document what they find, to put down their observations and their findings. Go ahead, Charlie. All right, and here's just an example of the intake and output worksheet. And I have a whole sheet on the instructions on how to set this simulation lab up. I also have the worksheet that goes through the different stations and also has some additional questions that I like to ask students, like, if the intake and the output don't add up at the end of the day, why could they be off? I also like to add students, why is it important to document milliliters versus cc's? I ask questions about why accurate documentation is important. And then, once they get the sheet done, we go over it together as a group. We look at, what kind of interventions did we think were needed? What did we get out for the amount? And how would you document that? And I really let the students kind of drive that discussion, because some of them come up with some really good ideas and are able to teach other students and be able to learn from other students. All right, Charlene.
So what Danielle described, I think most of you are probably doing in your skills labs. But as you're doing it, I wanted to really highlight for you how it is simulation, because you are likely printing worksheets and briefing students, then you're actually doing the simulation itself, and then you're having a debriefing, right? You're discussing and reviewing. And while you might do this for clinical skills with the mannequins, with acting out different scenarios, the piece that there's an opportunity to really increase is documentation simulation. So figuring out creative ways that students can practice the exercise of documenting, create simulation tools, and be able to be better prepared, not only for our simulation, but for the real world.
All right. What can we do during clinicals? Well, and we'll talk about this, as a group here pretty shortly, but this is probably one of the things that I feel, and with talking with other clinical instructors, is very difficult. Learning about documentation can be very difficult sometimes in the clinical setting, because your students are with other CNAs. You're not always right there with them to be able to see what they're observing and to have those conversations about documentation. And what they're doing is they are observing the CNAs though through documentation. So that's one of the ways definitely that they can learn about documentation. Then of course, as you're working with them, those real-time reminders from instructors about, hey, we just did this, we just did that. How would you document this? Okay. And then using simulating documentation, using a worksheet, coming up with a worksheet that could be used at the bedside, having students take notes, carry a notepad, be able to take those notes so that not only can they pass on anything that they need to pass on, but also to be able to then debrief with students, discuss those worksheets, the kinds of things that they've seen, the kinds of things that they found during the clinical, be able to talk about, how would you document those? And then, of course, review with the students and give them any feedback that you can. Okay. And here's an example of a report sheet. And, everybody does things just a little bit differently, but this one has quite a bit of the stuff that, we would ask in a clinical setting when students are working with residents to find out about their residents, any things that they may need to document on, but really just getting a good understanding of who it is they're caring for, what needs that person has, and then afterwards being able to look at what of these things, if they occur, should be documented.
Okay, thanks. So when I think about our role in the context of simulation, I'm going to switch over to the actual program. I think of our role as a way of consolidating the skills simulations, the simulations of documentation that you're doing in Skills Lab, because students don't get a chance to touch the EMR when they're in the facilities, or they usually don't get a chance to touch the EMRs when they're in the facilities. And at least in the patterns that we're seeing with the students who do the simulation, there may be a gap where some students are losing track of what's important to document when faced with an unexpected challenge. Residents short of breath, or they find something that wasn't in the care plan. And so we actually think that one way to even further enhance the impact of these simulations is actually to use some of these resources. So we provide documentation answer keys that go through, in the context of the story, why the correct documentation is X or Y or Z. And this, we designed it this way so that instructors would have the material to be able to lead a class discussion and debrief with your students about the simulation, discuss levels of dependence in the context of what happened with Ms. Sophie or with Darna or with Mrs. Rogers. Go ahead and review foot care and remind them about the importance of the care notes. It's an incredible, from my perspective, I think it would be really fun to sit with students and debrief about the simulation in general, but also specifically about the documentation. Another piece that we've included some pre-briefing materials where we orient students to sort of key points about documentation so they can learn. And we did this again because I think we started to believe that a lot of students may not be coming to the table with any experience around documentation. So we've created these both for students and instructors who may want to leverage the simulation as a chance to really talk to students about documentation and like specifically in anticipation of the simulation. So we have this resource, and we have another one that we want students to read right before they do the simulation. And of course, we have this level of dependence cheat sheet for everybody. So going back to our deck, the lessons that we're learning are inspiring us to really start teaching more about documentation, because the students are struggling to integrate. We're gonna be creating pre-briefing and debriefing videos, but I really think the most fun part would be for instructors to sit and discuss with their students. You could even actually just put the simulation documentation on the screen and do it together as a class, right? Go through the scenario and then ask the class to decide how to document, what to document. There's so many opportunities. So we are excited about our documentation, obviously, and want to encourage those of you who choose to use it to turn the documentation component of the simulation into a learning opportunity. Okay, that's what we have so far. These are those cheat sheets or documentation kind of orientation sheets, and I want to open up the floor for discussion and questions. Did any of the challenges we described with documentation ring true for you?
This is Kim Pena. I am the coordinator at Prairie State College. I think that we have a lot of these struggles. It's been very difficult teaching students. And when I am in the clinical setting, I do also teach high school and college level. And in the clinical settings, oftentimes the house CNAs are using the computer charting on the wall. So when I have an opportunity, I always bring my students over and say, could we just watch you? And, you know, about the ADLs, and I always tie that into, okay, so how much food did your resident eat? That would go into the charting. And there's always caveats about, you know, someone says, well, they ate about 35%, but in the charting, we know that it's 0 to 25 or 26 to 50. So it's challenging to do this. I know that some facilities are now doing an app on their phone. So I've actually have seen the house CNAs pull out their phone. I'm like, okay, they're on their phone. They shouldn't be on their phone, but they're actually pulling up their app, and all of the residents are in there. They're charting those ADLs, which I think is a great way to use technology. And I've often, this might be the answer to what I've been looking for our students anyways. I think it's a great opportunity to bring this in and kind of bridge that gap that I probably think so many of us have had. And this is a big part, I think, of the competency exam, of putting it together and being able to document, and when to document, what to document. And I think it would really increase their scores on their state exams when they can, you know, bring it all full circle. So not that I want to jump ahead of anybody else's, but I'm anxious to hear, you know, how this package works, and it, you know, how, I guess what it boils down to, the dollars and cents. So when I present it to my dean, that we could, you know, have it in such a way that I would hope that she would find it as beneficial as I do for the students. So thank you for your presentation so far. I've been enjoying it.
Thank you, Kim. And one thing we announced at the beginning, for those of you that joined a little bit after we started, we invite you to introduce yourself in the chat and connect to one another. You might discover other instructors in the same state as you. One of the things we learned in our very first webinar, when CNA Simulations was just an idea, it was literally an idea, was that CNA instructors were just really excited to meet each other across state lines. And so consider this also a networking opportunity in the chat. Okay, are there other thoughts or solutions that you've come up with to improve or enhance your students' understanding of documentation?
Charlene?
Yeah.
Hi, this is Julie Reynolds. I'm in San Antonio, Texas. I think I always stress to them when it comes to documentation that, whatever they put on paper or type in the computer that, basically that can turn into a legal document, right? It can be used in court. And so I always stress the importance of documenting facts and not their opinions on a
Yeah.
lot of things. Yes. So I do a lot of simulation in my class with paper documentation and also electronic documentation. But I've also put a lot of focus on the coding as far as zero dependency, one supervision. And actually, I find that with my students, they have, the independent and the supervision and the total is like really easy for them to understand, but they get a little confused when it comes to limited assist and extensive assist. So I just use with my hands, your hands are open and palms up, right? So if you're assisting the resident with the spoon and you have your open hands with palm up, all you're doing is this. So it's limited assist, right? And then I try to help them differentiate between limited and extensive in other ways. But also what I noticed just the other day was that they don't understand how they really didn't understand about how to document. You always document the highest level of assistance, during a certain activity that you may be assisting the person with. So I started trying to give them more examples where, maybe, the resident did something independently, right? Toileting, they were able to, unbutton their clothing, pull down their pants, and sit on the toilet. However, they were unable to wipe themselves, right? So yes, parts of that activity they did independently, but you, right, had to actually do the wiping and cleaning. So you would document that highest level of assistance. So that would be extensive and not independent, because I had a lot of students saying, oh, well, they were independent or just limited assist. So I find that students find it challenging to differentiate, between those two levels of assistance.
Thank you for that, Julie.
Uh-huh.
I'm gonna ask the group a question. How many of you have used the skills videos by Nurse Jar? Have you seen those on YouTube? Anybody? Not a one? Okay. Well, Nurse Jar is Julie Reynolds. I was basically gonna out her as from YouTube.
Hello.
And we've actually invited her to be the speaker next month, where she's going to talk about teaching testable skills. So we're aiming, oh, see, you got fans. Pat
I
Penn's like,
see.
I love
Hi.
Nurse
Thank you. Hi, y'all are embarrassing me.
So again, we'll send out an email, but the last Thursday of the month, 4 p.m., teaching testable skills, Nurse Jar. Okay, but back to what you were discussing. A whole bunch of people in the chat are like agreeing with you. Dory says she was just talking about this today. So yeah, this levels of dependence and trying to figure out how to figure out what limited versus extensive versus super. It's interesting. Do others have insights about that, or other tricks of the trade? Palms up, palms to the side. Anything? Any other tips that have worked for you guys? Oh, you got fans. And look at this. I love Nurse Jar. I love Nurse Jar. Yes, Nurse Jar is good.
Yeah, I think that I think you gave a really good example there, and I think that you really highlighted that the two areas that students struggle the most is that limited and that extensive. Because you're right, it's so easy to say, independent, supervised, or dependent, and sometimes they don't think about some of the things that they're doing for residents are dependent. But yeah, really just trying to differentiate between the two. And one of the things that I like to do at clinicals is I really like to, when I talk to the CNAs about, hey, these students are going to be working with you today, is really letting them know that they don't get to see the programs that you're using here, like you said, on the walls, on your phones, not the computers. They don't get to see that. They have no way of getting in there and seeing that. And you guys are so fast at it. So if you would slow down a little bit and give them a look at it. And usually when I remind them that, they go, oh yeah, that's right. We didn't have that in school, did we? And I'm like, no, you didn't have that in school. And so they're really good about it. And one of the other things I'll do too is I'll say, hey, you can work with my student and show my student your electronic documentation. I'll be more than happy to go down and help feed, this resident or take over this care for you. And so sometimes I'll just jump right in and do things to help out not only the residents, but the CNA so that they can in turn help my students with something that I'm not always able to.
Thanks, Danielle. Other thoughts or comments? I see, Jennifer, you were describing some of what you do in Jamaica, Queens. Do you want to share with the group? Is Jennifer still here? Oh, there you are. Wait. Actually, I think Jennifer is no longer on, so moving right along. Let's hear from others. Either reactions to what we presented, things that resonated with you, things that didn't, tips that you want to share with your peers across the country.
So Charlene, I want to just reiterate, I think it's something that you said earlier with like our students not really knowing what to document, like as far as their observations. And I think a lot of it, or like with what to do in certain situations, but I think a lot of it too is that they when they clip on to our wings, they don't want to let go. And so I think that it's really good, like at this point in time in my training, like when students ask me, well, Ms. J, what should we do? And I always tell them, I don't know. Like y'all think, right? You have to think, because you have to use your nursing judgment, your critical thinking, and that beautiful God-given gift, right? Your practical thinking skills or your common sense. So I try to, even like before we go to clinical, I try to get them in the habit of actually thinking for themselves, right? Because I'm only one person. There's 20 something of y'all, right? 20 something of y'all. And I'm not going to be able to be with everybody at the same time in clinical. So there's going to be some times where, you're going to be left with having to make a decision on your own, especially when you get out there in the real world, especially if you're going to be a nurse, right? Or even, as a CNA, there are going to be times where you're going to turn around and ain't nobody going to be there, right? To ask a question. So I think that it's really, really important that, as instructors, we try to get students to like really start thinking of their own. And I mean, I was surprised, like when I would tell them, I don't know, you tell me, y'all get together as an IDT and try to figure out what you need to do. And it just amazed me that they were putting all their nursing judgment and their critical thinking and practical thinking skills together, and really coming up with the solution on what they need to do or how they need to do something. And so a lot of times if you just like, you know, I don't know if I want to say throw your students to the wolves, right? Because that may sound a little harsh, but sometimes that's the only way that you're going to get them to let go of your wings and actually really use what they're going to have to use in the real world as a CNA or as a nurse. But I think a lot of them just don't understand how to do that, like how to use their nursing judgment or critical thinking or practical thinking skills. So I do like a whole lecture just on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I
Julie.
think that's a great idea. I always kind of laugh because I feel like the first day of clinicals, I feel like the students are just hanging on my leg and they don't, it's like I'm trying to push them off. And then by that last clinical, I think that's probably the most, I think, rewarding piece, other than the fact that we're creating caregivers and we need caregivers. And, but I think that's the most rewarding piece, is to see at the end of clinicals, these students have got it and they're excited. And usually they're like, Mrs. Young, can we do more days? And I'm like, no, we can only do what the state lets us sign up for. But yeah, it is truly rewarding. And I think too, that's one of the things I like about the simulations is, with like Mrs. Cruz and Mrs. Bull, some of these simulations that we have, is that it allows students to kind of go from that in between, from doing skills labs to clinicals. It's a nice in between for them to start with that beginning care, give that care, do that any care, and make some decisions, answer some questions and do some documentation for that resident before we, like you said, we kind of throw them to the wolves.
Thanks,
Which I think we've
Danielle.
all been there.
Dora, you said some interesting things in the comments. Did that some of this resonated with you?
I mean, I sit here and I chuckle and I nod my head and laugh because everything they're saying, Julie, I love the videos, love the videos. I'm like,
Thank you. Thank you.
watch, I get all excited more than the students, but anyway. Today we were just talking about their documentation and the importance of it, and how I brought up an example, 4 years later, I was in court from a case that I couldn't remember, but I said, if I documented it, I did it. If I didn't document it, I didn't do it. And they're like, well, what if, and I said, no, you document, as you guys mentioned, you document as soon as you do it, because why wait till the end of the shift? Because then it's like, did I, didn't I? When you're taking care of how many residents now does one CNA get? Some of my current students have graduated and said they got 20 students when they're working the night shift, or not students, you know what I mean, 20 residents. If not more than 20 residents. And they're like, how do we do it? And they're like, we turn around and you're not there, Mrs. G, you were there. When we needed you, you were there. And now we're alone. I almost texted you on my break. You need to answer a question. I said, no, we taught you how to answer those questions. So it's nice to hear back from the students. Excuse me. But with this current group of students that I have, documentation's a struggle. Just getting them to, as you commented, the spelling errors, computers can fix that, but in medical documentation, it can't. When they write something, there's no proof like on the computer or on their phones that might correct it. And just getting them to spell simple words correctly, because we know medical language is its own vocabulary, it's something different, and just getting them to pronounce it. And I said, and you guys might chuckle, the word assess, ASS-ESS. A student says, that's assess. I said, excuse me? And I said, can you say that again? She goes, assess. I'm like, oh. So she said that to another nurse that walked in the room, and the nurse thought she was saying ascites. And I'm like, oh boy, I don't know where we're going with this. I said, how do we go from assess to assist to ascites? We're, and we chuckle at it, but then I'm like, wow, if we wrote that for documentation purposes, what are we getting out of that? So they're like, well, isn't it there for us? Can't we just, I said, guys, spelling is a big, very important thing in our field. And I chuckle, but then I'm like, what am I up against? that these kids are relying on something to correct it for them, that they forget the A has an and an sound. You know, so just saying words and saying things, when a doctor says something to you, I might think this, but he meant this, or a family member says something and we have to relay it. Did we say it correctly? So it's just little things like that that we're trying to work on. I'm like, okay, it was funny with assist. We've heard that for 3 days. We've moved on to its assess. Assist is no longer a word in our dictionary in our room. We've moved on. And you know, you look at the maturity level of this, but you look back at COVID and how it hit and how this group of students, so I have 11th and 12th graders, where were they? And what has happened and how they've been exposed to things. So you're trying to expose them, get them to think about, so your scenarios that you showed, Charlene, yes, we were doing bedpan and stuff, but we got to focus on respiration. They're focusing on the task related to urination and everything that just related to urination and nothing else that happened in that situation. So respirations was a problem, but no, I'm documenting it's urinary day today. It's not respiratory day, it's urinary day. I'm not documenting respirations. It's like, no, you got to take the whole picture, not just urinary, not just bladder. Something else happened.
Yeah,
Sorry, I could
absolutely.
babble forever, but
No, that's such a good point. We do have to let them know you're taking care when you're in the setting and you're taking care of a resident, you're taking care of the whole resident,
Right.
You know, cognitive status, everything. And I think you bring up a really good point with the documentation and being able to spell, because that is something I have really noticed over the last couple of years is the spelling. And one of the things that we've been working really hard with for the simulations is developing lesson plans to help them to kind of help and guide the instructors through the simulations with their students. And one of the things in the lesson plans is to review the vocabulary that will be used, because vocabulary is very difficult for some of our students. But with that, one of the key things that I picked up that you said is not only teach them not only to teach them the vocabulary, but to be able to teach them the spelling of make sure they have the spelling down of some of the vocabulary for documentation's sake. Because ask them to spell ascites or edema. Yeah,
Could you have a spelling bee in class, like a CNA
absolutely.
Class spelling bee with a prize, right? Like I'm just aghast at how poor the spelling is. And I mean, I remember wanting to win the spelling bee when I was in school. We can't see what you're showing, Julie.
I just want to interject. This is what I have done because I agree with you on the spelling. I have to, I decided because the spelling was so bad, and I always tell my students, I'm not going to sit here and try to decipher what you have done. I mean, you know, what you have documented. And I said, you know, because sometimes in some situations, you know, time is really crucial and people really don't have time to sit there and try to decipher. So I started giving spelling tests along with the vocab test. And I found what I have to do is actually break it down in syllables for the students, as you know, like cardiomegaly or, you know, congenital. Like I have to break it down in syllables to try to help them to learn how to spell. I noticed this year students, you know, God bless them, they don't know how to spell. They do not know how to spell, and that is very important. And so I focus a lot. I teach them how to document electronically, but that in itself, you're just hitting icons, right? And I tell them, you know, there are going to be times where, you know, the electricity goes out. Generators may or may not kick in, and you're going to have to document flow sheets, you know. So incident reports, you know, you're going to have to do on paper. So I put a lot of focus, even though I teach how to document electronically, I put most of my documentation focus on paper documentation, even though a lot of facilities, you know, that's a thing of the past, but they have to know how to spell. they have to know. That's very crucial.
Absolutely. Pat Pence put some really interesting comments about nutrition. Is she still on? Yeah, there you go. Pat, could you share some of that with the group?
Yes, ma'am. This is Pat. What I had mentioned in the chat box was we have a nutrition lab, and with the nutrition lab, the students have chosen different menus, but it's usually a class choice before that, the lab is announced and on the schedule. But sometimes they have chosen breakfast foods, and sometimes it's salads. I mean, it's different types of things, but we have a different set of activities and documentation sheets that we do with that. But one of the activities is that they have to document at least 4 of their classmates, what they have. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you loud and clear.
Okay, good. Thank you. So they have to document their classmates, what their intake was, the percentage of the food from their plate, and also the amount of their fluid intake, and document it and convert it. So that's just one of the activities. But also they have to choose 4 therapeutic diets, and sometimes low sodium or specific sodium intake or diabetic diet, whatever they choose. And they have to state the foods that's on the table they're getting to eat from their menu that they've selected and brought in. But they have to document foods that have to be avoided and foods that are allowed. So that's just 2 of the activities that I mentioned.
Okay, thanks. And does that sound familiar for anyone, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that sounds pretty familiar. One of the things that I like to do with my students too is I have my students practice making thickened liquids. They make nectar, honey, and pudding thick, and I have the students try the liquids, and to get a feel for what the liquid consistency is and what it tastes like and what it feels like, and so they kind of have an understanding of what their residents are going through, because sometimes we have residents that don't want to comply with their dietary restrictions, and they kind of understand that. And then sometimes also they're like, oh, this isn't as bad as I expected, so they don't make those faces when they see those different thickened liquids. But I agree. And one of the things actually Charlene and I were talking about this morning that I've been talking to my students about is when it comes to documenting percentages of nutrition. If Charlene eats a small bowl of mashed potatoes, she eats it all. She ate 100%. If I eat if I have an entire plate of food and I only eat half of it, you're documenting 50% on me. Well, I ate more than Charlene did technically. So how else can we document that? Making sure that we're reporting that, because technically Charlene is looking like she's eating more, but she's really eating less. So really thinking about those observations when it comes to nutrition.
Absolutely, Danielle. Thank you. So one thing that we've been developing are these sort of lesson plans / curriculum integration guides for folks that are using the simulations. And Danielle is actually integrating within those curriculum integration plans how to integrate documentation learning as you're using the simulation. So we're going to release those the next couple of weeks for any of you on the call that already have the simulations. Stay tuned. We'll provide a little bit more guidance. Danielle is like doing it live with her students, and we're learning every day. The other thing I want to do is share my screen again so I can give Nurse Jar another plug. Join us on October 27th. Choose your time zone. I'm in Eastern, so it's 4 p.m. for me, but wherever you're based. And yeah, I'll see if there are any final comments or questions. And if anyone is interested in CNA Simulations that isn't already a user, just get in touch with me. I put a link in the chat to get on my calendar and my phone number. And everyone on this call is going to get a follow-up email with the link to the recording. And so my information will be in there as well. Any final thoughts or insights? Marilyn, any specific challenges with students who have disabilities and documentation?
What I heard so far, I agree with all of it. My biggest challenge is my student spelling, but finding out from them that they no longer have spelling and being taught to them. You know, it's word recognition now. So you have a word that you're supposed to learn and you pick the word out, all the words. And so where we used to have to learn how to spell the word and pronounce the word, they no longer have to do that. And so a lot of basic things that we were taught in school, they no longer have access to that. And so it is a struggle for them to spell words and pronounce words. So yeah, I totally agree. Spelling is a big part of what I have to deal with too. So we spend a lot of time, as much time as I have possible, because I only have my students anywhere from 3 weeks to 7 weeks to 9 weeks, and that's it. And then I'm finished. So I don't have a lot of time to spend on spelling words, but we try to start at the beginning, introducing them to different words and abbreviations and prefixes, suffixes, root words, all of that. Plus making sure that they know how to document nutrition right. So they have a lot to learn in a short period of time. And so, yes, it is a big challenge, but you know, the simulation is definitely helping us because they get a chance to work on it and at their own pace, and we can pull it up and we can discuss. I was talking when I was interviewing, I said, one of the things that I love was when she was doing her foot care, and I can't remember which one. I think it's Miss Sophie. It's Miss Sophie. It's Miss Sophie. When she was doing her foot care, how she had to stop at that moment and be able to contact the nurse to let her know that I have found something out of the ordinary. And so those kind of things really help them, you know, to be more visual, to know what to look for. And like with Miss, when she had the discharge, and I said, well, how would you document that? You know, because you need to know how you're going to document, how you're going to report it to the next person at the end of your shift. So those are good conversational pieces that we are finding within the simulation. And then it helps my students because I do teach students who have disabilities, and most of them are learning disabilities. And so all of the being able to have the simulation has truly helped them and have built up their confidence.
That is wonderful, Marilyn. Actually, so in the simulation we just released is catheter care. Teresa discovers a yeast infection. So that's the unexpected challenge of that brand new module. Thank you. We have like 1 minute left, but I'm going to ask Mindy a question because Mindy works for a facility, right? So they train CNAs and then they go to work for the same organization. Are you finding some of these challenges to be true with the staff, like the students when they get onto the floors? Are they still like struggling with documentation or spelling? Like how, I'm curious about that transition from CNA class to the floor in the same institution. But Mindy might not be exactly, oh, wait. Yeah, Mindy might not realize that I'm talking to her. Okay, oh well. Well, I'll ask Mindy separately, and if she says something interesting, I will share it with you all. But we are at exactly 5 o'clock. I am so excited about this discussion. Dory said in the chat that this should be a monthly event. We are trying. That's why in 1 month we're going to have Nurse Jar, and we're working to create a monthly cadence. I can't promise we're going to do every month, but we're going to try our very best. And we've loved this as much as you guys. So thank you so much for joining us. Again, everyone knows how to find me. And with that, have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Have a good evening, guys. Thank you.